Dr. Dowdle, did you play a role, or did your agency play a role in the administration's request to rescind $41 million of the amount that was appropriated in the fiscal 1986 budget for AIDS purposes?
I'm sorry, did we play a role, sir?
In the rescission request for $41 million.
There was a request for rescission, yes.
Yes, I know that there was.
Yes.
My question is, did your scientists make that request? How did that rescission request come about?
No, sir, but that request did not relate to the drug program.
It related to the AIDS
Yes,
overall
sir.
program, right?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Right.
And the question is, did your agency, did the scientists in your agency suggest that, in fact, that the program could do without that additional $41 million?
The department suggested that we could do without the $41 million, yes, sir.
On the basis of the scientists making that determination?
The basis for that rescission was that that was not in the original request which went forward in 86, the President's original budget.
Well, of course it wasn't. The history over the course of these past 4 years has been that the Congress has repeatedly thrust money upon NIH to do its work, and the administration constantly fought those efforts, and each year it came back asking for less money than Congress had thrust upon NIH the year previously. You're familiar with that history?
Yes, sir.
And yet, as Dr. Fauci indicated to Mr. Levin, that you could use more money to do the work that's required. Isn't that so?
That's right.
And as Dr. Fauci indicated, indeed, Dr. Hirsch was quoting public health service figures. I was quoting public health service figures in the opening statement that I made, projection that over the course of the next 5 years, Public Health Service projects that between 200,000 and 450,000 Americans will develop full-blown AIDS. That we're talking about an epidemic of massive proportions here, aren't we?
Yes, sir.
And that, if anything, Congress itself has been providing insufficient amounts of money, not too much money, for dealing with the AIDS crisis. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
I thank you, gentlemen, for yielding.
Questions. I don't know if it's only a drop in the bucket, but when you add up your testimony, I think the word disgrace probably applies. And I know it isn't your responsibility to, in the end, make the decision on the scope of programs. But I think we had all better wake up to the threat this poses in individual human terms as well as national terms. And I think we have to ask ourselves why we aren't doing all that we can do that would be effective. And I went back and looked at the testimony a few years ago. It's now 3 years ago, Mr. Chairman, almost, since you held a hearing. And we were concerned about the complacency that that was between the sentences of the testimony. One statement, well, we've had unfunded grants throughout history. That's not going to change. Well, if we're dealing with an illness that isn't fatal, maybe so. But when we're dealing with a disease of this magnitude and this impact, I don't know how any of us in government, whether we're in the executive or the legislative, can sit and excuse doing anything less than what is effectively possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin. Aside from the, Dr. Fauci, aside from the new federal treatment centers, how many individuals are currently enrolled in clinical trials testing therapeutic drugs for AIDS, ARC, and/or infection, would you include public and private tests in your estimate?
Yeah, we would estimate that approximately 3,000 individuals prior to the announcement of the treatment evaluation units yesterday have been in some form of clinical trial.
And do you have a breakdown as to how much of that is being done with federal support and how much of it is done with strictly private funding?
I don't. Perhaps Dr. Mari does from the registration of the FDA. Do you have it?
We could probably make some estimate for the record, Mr. Chairman, but I can't give it right off the top of my head.
I'd appreciate your submitting that information for the record. Thank you. How many individuals, including those participating in the new treatment evaluation units, will be enrolled in clinical trials each year in 1986, 87, 88, 89, and 90? What's your projection?
Yeah. That projection, again, is going to be a very dynamic, based on a dynamic situation, Mr. Chairman. Let me explain what I mean, and I think that might perhaps impact on the point that Mr. Levin made regarding how can you project about how much is being done or needs to be done. The studies that we're initiating in the treatment evaluation units are involving initially phase 1 and phase 2 study, which just by the very structure of those studies require limited numbers of patients to ask very specific questions under controlled conditions. We fully hope and anticipate that we will be able to test drugs that will be shown to be safe and efficacious enough in phase 1 and 2 to expand into phase 3. Now, if that happens at that point in 1989, 1991, we would hope that we will be able to markedly expand the studies to be able to handle the phase 3 trial of the study. So I think it's really going to depend on the kinds of results that we start to see in the first year or two. It may be that we have multiple drugs that are good enough to go into phase 3. If that's the case, then that will determine a greater expansion of the studies. Whereas if we keep hitting a stone wall and we only have drugs that we show are either too toxic or not even a little bit efficacious, we have to keep going through the phase 1 and the phase 2 component of the study. So it really is going to be a dynamic situation.
Well, you know, Dr. Dowdle, Dr. Fauci, if in fact the public health service projections are anywhere near the mark, and I assume that that range of 200,000 to 450,000 is flexible enough and open-ended and broad enough so that it's probably a close, an accurate estimate. If in fact it is accurate, the pressures that you are going to have across the length and breadth of this country for demonstrating urgency and commitment in dealing with this problem are going to be just fierce. I think that although the numbers have been out there and you've done a good job in projecting the numbers, I don't think that they've really sunk in yet as far as the general public is concerned, nor the fact that it is now crossing across the previous at-risk populations into the heterosexual community, and that the rate of new diagnoses is much higher in that community than in the homosexual community. I think that as that information sinks in, you're going to find that the kind of slow motion efforts which we observe from here are going to be perceived throughout the country. And it just seems to me that somewhere soon along the line, you people who are the scientists are going to have to make the point to the administration, to the political people who are making dollars and cents judgments, that in fact they'd better get with it as far as beginning to meet the needs are concerned, because otherwise you are going to have really a massive outcry in this country that in fact the population at large is being allowed to be at risk without an appropriate response by the government agencies charged with that response. I mean, that it seems to me is what your studies and your projections really lead to. And all that we're trying to do here, again, is to express the sense of concern for the lack of of sufficient response by the federal agencies. And again, we're not blaming the scientific people for making the wrong decisions. That's not within your power. But I think that it is within your power to persuade the numbers people, the political people in the administration, that they are really just totally misunderstanding the seriousness, the gravity of this situation. Let me ask you, does NIH have sufficient funds for the current year, fiscal year 1986, to support all the planned clinical trials, including those that will be conducted in the treatment evaluation units?
The clinical trials with regard to the treatment evaluation units that are being planned, yes, we do have sufficient funds. There's been $20 million allocated to those clinical trials, and we have sufficient money in fiscal year 86.
Under current plans, about how many drugs are expected to be tested in clinical trials in each of the next 5 years?
Well, there are at least 4 to 6 drugs that are right now in a situation where we'd be ready to take a look at them. We have a system of input and evaluation of what should be put into clinical trial and ultimately putting into clinical trial. And literally, as the weeks and months go by, more drugs get submitted into this, what we call our drug selection committee, which is an NCI-NIAID collaboration, to evaluate what drugs will go through the next step. So there's been a number of drugs evaluated. I really can't tell you what are planned to go into trials a few years from now. It may be a very large number. It will depend upon both our screening procedure, and we also do have a structure set up where large numbers of drugs will be screened for their efficacy against the virus, first in the test tube and then with preclinical studies. And we've also initiated a national cooperative drug discovery group in collaboration with the Cancer Institute, in which we will de novo target antiviral therapy against the AIDS virus. So the screening, the drugs that are already available, and the targeted development will all be factors that will enter into what the ultimate number of drugs that will be available for testing over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Is it your sense, your estimate, your judgment, that $20 million for each of the next 5 years, a total of $100 million, will in fact be sufficient to deal with these clinical trials, to handle adequately the clinical trials? Is that a scientific judgment that you've made, or are you responding to numbers which have been, or limits which have been suggested to you, again, by OMB or whoever else is making those numbers judgments?
Again, given the necessity to constantly reevaluate the situation because of the dynamic nature of it, I would not at all be surprised that as we get drugs that are ready to go into phase 2 and phase 3, that are already in phase 1 and phase 2, that we will need more resources to evaluate drugs in the coming years.
Well, I hope that as that occurs, that you will in fact come to us, and the scientists come to us and tell us what the needs are, rather than having Congress, in essence, force the money on you. I understand that a special task force was established earlier this year, and we've had some reference to it earlier with the other panel, to establish standards for effectiveness of AIDS drugs for both their release in compassionate use and for their final marketing approval. Did the task force establish the standards for the marketing of AIDS drugs, and if so, what is the standard?
The task force set down criteria for when, in the course of a given clinical trial, a drug would be deemed to have shown sufficient promise prior to the time that it has been absolutely conclusively shown to be safe and efficacious. What criteria would you use to then make that drug available on what we call a treatment IND? And it was the mandate of that task force to set down the criteria, and the criteria you yourself just read to the previous witnesses.
But that was not marketing efficacy standards.
There has been no reference or mention to the actual marketing of drugs. We were merely mandated to set down criteria at which point we would then have a drug available for a treatment IND.
The task force agenda in Appendix 2 of the endpoints documents indicates, and I quote from B, the items for consideration by the task force as defined by the mandate are identified below. B, what endpoints will be used as clinical evidence of efficacy in the treatment of the following: full-blown AIDS-related conditions, seropositive, asymptomatic. You really did not address the marketing aspect.
No, we did not, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Dr. Meyer.
could I just add to what Dr. Fauci said? I don't think that was the task force charge to deal specifically with the treatment IND issue, but you can't deal with that in isolation. The same type of criteria you're looking at there, those are criteria that relate to safety and efficacy is the basis upon which you market a drug too. So the two are very closely related.
Over the course of the last year, the committee has received testimony on a number of occasions about the importance of using viral cultures to determine the effectiveness of the treatments for AIDS. Many researchers have expressed concern, however, about the cost and complexity of this and the lack of laboratory facilities. Was it the position of the task force that this was the only viable method for determining the effectiveness of AIDS drugs?
No, it was not. The task force emphasized very clearly that there would have to be clinical criteria for the establishing of whether or not a drug was safe and effective. The viral isolation is an important component supplementing the studies, as are immunological observations about improvement of immunological status. But it is not necessary in a clinical study to always have an effect on viral isolation, though that really is very important. An example that I think you probably have heard of, Mr. Chairman, of a situation in which a drug in early testing, Suramin, was shown to have an effect in 4 patients of blocking the ability to isolate the virus. If that had been used as the criteria for whether or not that drug should have been released for wider use, it really would have been a serious mistake, because as it turned out, we tested the drug further and it was shown not only did it not effectively block the virus in larger numbers of patients, but it actually was extremely toxic and in some patients caused an acceleration of the Kaposi sarcoma. I think this again underscores the need of doing carefully controlled studies, including the clinical criteria that we mentioned in our task force deliberations.
Turning then to the criteria for efficacy to release drugs for compassionate use, describe in as lay term as possible the new criteria.
The criteria would vary depending upon the subset of patients. For example, if, as I mentioned to you when I gave you the explanation concerning how protocols will be drawn up for our treatment evaluation units, one of the criteria is a decrease in the frequency of opportunistic infections. In lay terms, if you have someone who has had a bout of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, you would expect that within a certain period of time, 36, 40 weeks or what have you, that person would have multiple other opportunistic infections and would ultimately expire, usually from an opportunistic infection associated with that particular subgroup of patients. If you follow patients in the study and you're comparing them with other individuals in the same group who are very similar in the level of their disease, and you find out that in fact you've decreased the frequency of opportunistic infection, this is an important criteria. When you're dealing with an individual who has Kaposi sarcoma, it's a partial or complete remission in the measurable lesions, since Kaposi sarcoma frequently attacks the skin and they're visible lesions that are readily measurable, that's something that you can monitor during the course of a study. We put down that they should show complete or partial remission which was sustained over a 2-month period in order to avoid the naturally occurring vicissitudes that you sometimes see in individuals even who have no treatment at all, and this must be associated or accompanied by an increase in immunological function according to a variety of parameters. And again, lastly, when you're dealing, for example, with an individual with ARC or an individual who has asymptomatic carrier, that you decrease the incidence of conversion from ARC to full-blown AIDS or from an asymptomatic carrier either to ARC or to full-blown AIDS. So there's multiple different types of criteria depending upon the patient population that you're starting with.
Now, how do these new criteria compare with the compassionate use criteria that had been in effect prior?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by compassionate use criteria that were in effect prior. Since there were no drugs really that were available in testing, there were no compassionate use criteria that were delineated prior to these criteria. Perhaps Dr. Meyer could answer this with regard to FDA.
I would agree with what Dr. Fauci had said. There have been treatment INDs for many drugs. Typically, a treatment IND, making it widely available to large numbers of patients with minimal supervision, is done when a drug has reached enough evidence or enough promise of safety and effectiveness to feel that this is a safe thing to do during the usual intervening months before the drug gets final approval. The task force that Dr. Fauci chaired came together and considered this matter before any of us felt we had a drug for AIDS that had reached that stage. In other words, it was anticipating that this was surely going to be a problem in the future because that task force be put together. We were all together saying, when a drug gets to a stage, what stage is it going to get to? And as Dr. Fauci says, at the time the task force met and discussed this issue in detail, it did not feel that any of the drugs before us yet had reached that stage. I mentioned specifically azithromycin, which the task force did discuss as an example. And at the time that the double-blind clinical trials, placebo clinical trials were getting started for azithromycin, this was several months ago, the task force, I think, almost universally felt that although the drug appeared to have promise, enough promise to go into the double-blind clinical trials, the drug had not reached enough promise and enough evidence of possible safety or effectiveness to justify its use on a treatment IND.
Didn't the old criteria for efficacy to release drugs for compassionate use include provisions such as increasing the T4 count or inhibiting the virus or improving clinical conditions?
No, as the group Dr. Fauci chaired, looked at that. The question of the clinical significance of some of these changes in immunologic parameters is strictly unknown. And so, as the task force concluded, one needs some criteria that gives you a feeling that there is actually promise that the drug might do something for AIDS. And Dr. Fauci mentioned those criteria. If you're talking about AIDS, it's that the drug appears to be having some effect upon reducing the opportunistic infections that will ultimately kill you, or that the drug actually is increasing your survival. Actually, it might easily do both of those things. By decreasing the opportunistic infections, it would increase your survival. But those are felt to be the type of criteria that you can rely on. As he mentioned, depending upon a reduction in viral culture, is we would consider it a treacherous criteria as just a change in immunologic function by itself. Those are two unpredictable quantities in terms of what their clinical significance would be.
Dr. Meyer, has the FDA granted any compassionate INDs under any circumstances in regards to AIDS to date? And if so, on what criteria?
I would use the term treatment IND, sir, and not compassion, because we've defined what we mean by a treatment IND. A treatment IND is an IND in which you have enough evidence of preliminary evidence of safety and at least promise of effectiveness to make it reasonable to make that drug available on a broader basis. I think that technically I would say that in terms of actual AIDS drugs, we probably haven't really reached that. We've come close to that. What we've actually done is where there have been patients, the primary use of AIDS drugs has been, I mean, the greatest use has probably been in phase 1 protocols, where you're pressing patients into the early study, looking for evidence of toxicity on administration, looking for evidence of what dose can be given safely to someone, and there have been a number of patients who've wanted the drug, who've been placed into that type of protocol, but I don't call that a treatment IND protocol. I really call that a phase 1 protocol. I mean, to the patient, it has the same result. He's getting the drug without being on a placebo study, but to the investigator, you're actually getting very detailed experimental data from that patient.
Dr. Meyer, I don't want to get bogged down in the morass of semantics. I use the word compassionate in compassionate INDs because that's the word that's used in the task force agenda that we've been talking about. It says compassionate IND. At what point in the determination of efficacy should the release of drugs in compassionate INDs be allowed? So I assume that that in fact compassionate IND as a term of art is as usable as the term treatment IND.
Well, I think that, I don't have the report before me, sir, but I think there's quotations around that term compassionate.
Is not. No, not at all. Not at all.
We slipped up, sir.
Well, but again, as I say, I don't want to talk about the semantic difference. I really like to know, and I suspect that we're getting to another semantic morass when we talk about phase 1 rather than treatment IND. How many patients have been granted the phase 1 IND by, or authorized for use by FDA, and which drugs?
I can give you an approximation, sir. As Dr. Fauci indicated, when we did an approximation of the total numbers of patients who have either received an experimental drug for AIDS or are currently being enrolled in a protocol, which means they'll receive one very shortly, that number is about 3,000. As I looked at the numbers from you're looking at a list of 29 drugs and many types of protocols, it would appear to me that about half of those have been in what we would call phase 1 studies, studies in which there is no placebo. You're looking essentially at question of dosage and toxicity, and the other half are in ones that are controlled studies, more like the Burroughs Wellcome study we've been mentioning with acetylthymidine, or similar studies that are ongoing with ribavirin, in which they're controlled.
Would you, for the record, try to respond to the question as to how many compassionate or treatment INDs were granted by FDA, on what criteria, how many patients, which drugs? If you can try to do that for us at the same time that you're getting the numbers for us, that would be helpful.
Yes, sir, I'll do that.
How does the stringency of the new criteria for release of AIDS drugs under compassionate use differ from that for release of cancer drugs? It's my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that the system for making experimental drugs available for cancer is much more flexible and lenient than it appears to be for AIDS drugs. Is that right?
I'll comment, and perhaps Dr. Broder would like to comment. We've looked at this very carefully, sir. In fact, we were looking at it back at the time that Dr. Fauci chaired the committee as to what type of precedent we had.
Would you hold the microphone just a little closer?
Right. When you look over a period of a number of years, there's clearly been an evolution of policy and evolution of cancer treatment methods and so forth. But if you speak in terms certainly of the last several years, to the best of my judgment, I feel that our general policies in dealing with AIDS drugs and dealing with cancer drugs are essentially identical. My feeling is that we're saying that, I might add for the orphan drugs, the orphan drug legislation was mentioned. There again, you're encouraging the use of treatment INDs, but only after you have at least some preliminary evidence suggesting that the drug in question is adequately safe and effective. And I think the same criteria Dr. Fauci's committee has applied to AIDS drugs, and I think the same general criteria are used for treatment INDs on cancer drugs.
Dr. Broder, you want to comment on that?
I would agree with what Dr. Myers has said, with the addition that a treatment IND arrangement would not be involved in the release of a cancer chemotherapeutic agent unless there were scientific reasons for concluding that the drug had a reasonable expectation of benefiting the patient. It doesn't mean that the drug could be generally available or that all issues related to toxicity or usage had been resolved, but that one could formulate a reasonable expectation that it was in the patient's interest to receive the agent under discussion.
I think we'll all agree that it's important to make sure that drugs are safe and effective before they're allowed to be marketed. And to do that, we have to make sure that the testing of the drugs is done under a controlled regimen. But the method we use to control these tests in this epidemic is the subject of great controversy. In your testimony, Dr. Dowdle, you state that either a placebo or a standard therapy can be used as control. Since there is now no standard therapy, you're in fact requiring placebo-controlled trials. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, are there any alternatives which could be used in the current crisis?
Well, Dr. Meyer may want to comment this. There are some exceptions to this. The placebo, and I think, in fact, I'd like to have each of our panelists here comment on that.
I think we all have probably opinions on this, sir, and we probably all feel pretty much the same about it. I'd like to stress, first of all, because we haven't really had the chance to say this, is that everybody on this panel has a personal commitment to trying to get out effective drugs to treat AIDS patients at the earliest possible time. We all feel that is a very intense and personal thing. Part of our response professionally is trying to be sure that we not only protect patients against unnecessary harm, but that we also take no action that might delay the arrival of an effective drug. The HPA-23 example in France was given. After several years of France using that drug in the way they use, we still have no idea of what the usefulness of that drug is, and we will not until the controlled clinical trials will be finished in this country, it's among the drugs Dr. Fauci will be testing. That is a dreadful situation, to my point of view, and I think the point of view of others on the panel. We would like to see that from the moment you have something that might be promising to where you find that it either is or isn't, and you can make it available to everybody if it is the shortest possible time. And the example I would give is azithromycin on that. There has been no drug that has moved as fast through the system, the drug development system, as azithromycin. It is moving literally like a greased pig, if I may use that example. We will know within a few months' time if that drug is highly effective. We will certainly know it within a period of months, perhaps as short a time as 6 months. If it's moderately effective or slightly effective, it may take longer. But if that occurs, I mean, when we have that information, then that drug will go out on the market and will be available to every AIDS patient that's out there. So much of our action is conditioned on that type of response.
But wouldn't you think that your agency and NIH would be in a better position to, in fact, critique the HPA-23 situation had, in fact, our system undertook a clinical testing of HPA-23?
We did from the start encourage the overseas manufacturers to bring HPA-23 here for clinical testing, which they did. And in fact, the first, what I would call solid phase 1 trials of that drug were conducted in the U.S. They were not conducted in France. And I'm convinced that the first evidence of what the value of that drug will be probably generated in this country.
When is the clinical testing of that beginning?
The clinical testing of that began last spring or last winter. It's already well into phase 1 trials, enough so that Dr. Fauci mentioned it's a drug that will be being considered for his treatment centers in the coming months. But there are already a number of centers that have had HPA-23 under treatment in this country, getting the data that should have been gotten 2 or 3 years ago. Coming back to controlled trials, though, you were asking specifically about controlled trials. One of the things that drives Dr. Hurst when he was testifying to talk about controlled trials, and one of the things that impresses all of us, is if you have thousands of patients out there with a disease that are going to die of that disease, then anything that delays getting a drug out, an effective drug, is really a terrible thing to do. We know that taking the azithromycin model, for example, Burrs Wellcome has chosen to go in double-blind clinical trials. We know that with that format, they will be able to generate data about whether that drug is effective or isn't effective far faster than any other format they can use, so that we'll have a definitive answer within a very short period of time. And this is one of the reasons we lean toward favoring controlled trials. There are other other ways, other ways to control trials, though. For example, you may reach a point that a two-dose, a high dose and a low dose, is a possible way of conducting a controlled trial. You can also sometimes do crossover trials. There are various ways to do controlled trials, but at least in terms of acetylthymidine, which we mentioned, the particular types of trials designed for it, I think, with placebo control, will probably give us an answer faster than any other option that were open to them.
Dr. Fauci, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I agree with the statement that was just made, but also with Dr. Hirsch's statement regarding the need for controlled placebo trials. You don't need a placebo if you have an absolute certainty of the natural course of a disease in every case. And I think one of the misconceptions is that we know exactly what's going to happen in individuals with AIDS. Although one can project that within a 5-year period, most of the patients will succumb to the disease. In fact, those of us who see AIDS patients every day, it becomes very clear to us that the natural history is quite variable. And one of the great problems that we could put ourselves into is using a control that's not an adequate control and feeling that an agent, in fact, was helpful when it isn't, which would delay the availability of an agent that you would ultimately prove to be effective, or to have an agent that, in fact, would be dangerous to individuals. I gave you the Suramin story, but I was interested, Mr. Chairman, in listening to the statements of the AIDS patients themselves who appeared before this committee. The first witness, Mr. Papa, mentioned his dismay that after 4.5 to 5 years, physicians still don't know whether or not pneumocystis carinii pneumonia can be effectively prophylaxed against by giving prophylactic Bactrim or what have you, and he manifested a great deal of dismay, in fact, criticism at the medical investigators for that. That's the perfect example and argument for a controlled clinical trial, because if that trial had been done years ago where individuals either did not have any prophylaxis or were given prophylaxis for PCP, we would know right now in 1986 whether prophylactic antibiotics was beneficial and safe in individuals with AIDS. We don't know that 5 years later. The HPA-23 data, I just came back from Paris, and I spoke in great detail with my French colleagues. They all readily admit that the data that was accumulated in France is totally worthless because it was not done under a controlled clinical trial. So there really
but,
are...
the great criticism, if you will, is that, in fact, until Congress started pressing this past year, there was precious little that was being done here by the Public Health Service to undertake those clinical trials. And so, it's not sufficient, it seems to me, for you to be an outside observer saying, yeah, it's terrible that after 4.5, 5 years, we don't have any of those answers. The fact is that there was a very, very slow start in suggesting that you're going to run out of patients.
No,
Your figures indicate quite the contrary.
No,
projections.
the only thing I'm suggesting, Mr. Chairman, is that if we don't do the trials in the properly scientifically controlled way, there's an excellent chance that we will not have the answer, or we will have it in a much delayed fashion, which would be terrible for the individuals who have the disease.
Is there no role for historical controls in the clinical test?
In a situation such as this, there may be changes that one is looking for. Again, if the scenario were such that we would have a penicillin-like drug for AIDS where you gave it and within a few months you would absolutely know that you made the person well, perhaps under those circumstances that a historical control might be appropriate. But I think virtually all investigators in AIDS realize that given the complexity of the disease and the variety of defects and manifestations of the disease, that we're not going to see a penicillin-like effect. There will be subtle effects on sizes of lesions, on frequency of opportunistic infections, and perhaps on immunological parameters that might be missed as well as the toxicity that might be missed if the controls are not done as they should be.
Then you don't accept the formulation expressed by Dr. Levine that where you in undertaking the evaluations and the clinical testing.
And I would like very much to avoid in 1991, when there are 270,000 patients with AIDS in this country, that we're 5 years down the pike and we still don't know what's safe and effective because we haven't done the properly controlled clinical trial.
But you're not suggesting that you're going to run out of patients.
No,
Your figures indicate quite the contrary.
No,
projections.
the only thing I'm suggesting, Mr. Chairman, is that if we don't do the trials in the properly scientifically controlled way, there's an excellent chance that we will not have the answer, or we will have it in a much delayed fashion, which would be terrible for the individuals who have the disease.
Is there no role for historical controls in the clinical test?
In a situation such as this, there may be changes that one is looking for. Again, if the scenario were such that we would have a penicillin-like drug for AIDS where you gave it and within a few months you would absolutely know that you made the person well, perhaps under those circumstances that a historical control might be appropriate. But I think virtually all investigators in AIDS realize that given the complexity of the disease and the variety of defects and manifestations of the disease, that we're not going to see a penicillin-like effect. There will be subtle effects on sizes of lesions, on frequency of opportunistic infections, and perhaps on immunological parameters that might be missed, as well as the toxicity that might be missed if the controls are not done as they should be.
Then you don't accept the formulation expressed by Dr. Levine that where you have people with full-blown AIDS as meeting the definition of CDC for full-blown AIDS, that there is almost no ethical justification for giving people in that condition placebos.
I disagree with Dr. Levine, and I agree with Dr. Hirsch, who said the opposite of that.
A great deal was written about the possible effectiveness of a combination therapy consisting of an antiviral and an immune enhancer, and we had some discussion about that in the prior panel. And indeed, your testimony states that, Dr. Otto, that this is the best short-term possibility that we have. However, my understanding is that current protocols prohibit combination testing until each drug is completely tested individually. Dr. Meyer, that's correct, isn't it?
Not entirely, sir. I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to correct what Dr. Levine said.
Okay, would you again pull the microphone close to you, please?
Yes, sir. It's a question of trying to get the answer, a clear answer in the fastest way. The question was asked at the previous panel about whether you had to do tests on two drugs separately. It's hard to compare two unknowns at the same time. If you take two drugs that you don't know anything about their safety and effectiveness, and to put them together, it makes it very hard to sort out what the answer is. So what is usually found in a practical way is that you get one drug and determine that it has safety and effectiveness, and only then do you consider adding a second drug to the list. The regulation that I think was being referred to, the regulation deals with the fact that if you have a combination of drugs, each of the components has to play an active part, or at least contribute to the usefulness of the drug. And that's to keep you from putting in a component that is more or less, I'd say, a trash component, a component that might be toxic but not actually have a beneficial effect. I think everybody's against that. But what one can do in getting from here to there in the most rapid way is, let's say, if a drug like azithromycin or ribavirin shows promise, let's say the double-blind clinical trials going on them, the first results begin to come in through Dr. Fauci's committees that show that, in fact, yes, those trials show you're getting a effectiveness for AIDS. By that time, you have a reasonable evidence on toxicity. Then at that point, there's nothing to keep you from adding interferon or from adding interleukin-2 or something else in a protocol that compares just the one drug and the combination. Now, in actual fact, in setting up the protocol, the people setting that protocol up might have let's say azithromycin as one arm, combination with interleukin-2, say, as a second arm, and they might very well put in interleukin-2 as a third arm, but the reason that'd be put in is because they could probably get statistical information faster about whether the thing was effective or not. This isn't...
I'd like to see how that fits into the statement issued by Dr. Fauci yesterday in announcing the 14 medical centers where the statement as to agents likely to be tested in AIDS treatment evaluation units says in the second sentence, combination approaches to therapy, paren antiviral and immunomodulator, close paren, will not be considered for clinical trials until each agent is evaluated independently. Dr. Fauci?
That's true. That's something from the initial trials that we're getting underway right now will not be using combination until we get some preliminary information from the agents that are being tested individually. But we fully expect to launch on combination therapy, which we actually all feel strongly will probably be the ultimate major and most optimal approach towards the therapy of AIDS, is using either an antiretroviral agent and an immunoenhancer. So in principle, we all feel strongly that combination therapy will be important. The statement that was made that initially, right off, we would be testing drugs individually.
But doesn't the Cool-Font report, which was issued only at the beginning of last month, this month, still, no, it's last month, it is July 1st, doesn't the Cool-Font report also state that, quote, combination strategies must be developed and evaluated?
Yes, there's no disagreement in principle there, Mr. Chairman. We fully intend to test these, but in the initial phases of these studies, out of the treatment evaluation units, we'll be testing individual agents until we have sufficient information, which hopefully will not take too long, to put the appropriate combinations together.
Mr. Chairman, may I interject?
Of course, Dr. Broder.
To follow up and extend what Dr. Fauci has said is that underlying principle, I come from an institute which has a great emphasis on combination chemotherapeutic approaches. In the last 3 or 4 presentations that I've made at scientific meetings, I've attempted to discuss the principle that not only could one deal with combinations in the sense that Dr. Fauci is using the term, but that one might use certain known pharmacological principles to construct strategies using combinations of antiviral agents. And within the intramural program, we have, in fact, in collaboration with a private sector pharmaceutical house, begun certain types of combination protocols on a pilot basis. I feel confident that this will be a topic that the AIDS drug evaluation units will be able to handle, and the drug selection committee, which I chair, I feel confident will be very receptive to appropriately constructed protocols with appropriate scientific rationales that involve combinations in a broad use of that term. So if that's an issue of concern, I can assure you that that is not a real problem.
Well, it is at this moment, and I guess the question that I'm seeking is the determination to be on toxicity or efficacy? On what basis will you ultimately rule out combination testing, and on what basis will you approve or undertake combination testing?
The same criteria as in others, it's safety and efficacy.
Well, so that if in fact you find that a drug used by itself is not effective, you're going to rule that out even though the drug in combination with another may be effective?
No.
Isn't that really what the discussion is all about?
No. A scenario where you might not have, by the strict criteria, evidence of efficacy, but nonetheless a drug is safe. For example, if you have an antiviral agent that is blocking the viral replication but is showing absolutely no improvement in a patient's immune function or in their clinical status, the good sense would be that perhaps if you come in with another agent that would be an immunomodulator that would, by another mechanism, enhance the immune response, even though that original antiviral agent, although safe, was not effective in causing any clinical improvement, we would not at all hesitate to use an agent like that together with an immunomodulator. I might point out to the Chairman that in intramural studies, we ourselves have already been using combinations of antiretroviral therapy together with immunological reconstitution, for example, with bone marrow transplant. So it's something that not only in principle we favor, but in fact we are doing. I'm sorry for the confusion on that, but that we are in favor of that.
Well, I'm confused because you do state that the best short-term possibility seems to be a combination, and then in the announcement yesterday you said that you don't intend to use it, and your testimony here just now says that no, you're not ready to start to use that. So it is confusing, to say the least. In the Coolfont report, you make, Dr. Fauci, many excellent recommendations as to steps that should be taken to stop the spread of the disease. Has a cost analysis for these research, treatment, education, and counseling programs been done? If so, what is the estimated cost of implementing the programs? And if no cost estimate has been done, is one planned? And do you plan to increase your budget request for fiscal year 1987 to cover the cost of implementing these programs? Dr. Dowdle?
You're talking about in general, so are you not, the Information Education Risk Reduction Program?
I'm talking about the report of the Coolfont Planning Conference dated June 4 to 6, 1986, in which you make a whole series of recommendations as to steps that should be taken to stop the spread of the disease. But given the fact that you all have the responsibility for following through on those recommendations, my question is whether, in fact, you've costed them out.
Yes.
And if so, whether you're going to be asking for additional funding to start fulfilling the recommendations.
We have costed those out, sir, and they are under consideration in the department now.
Would you, for the record, submit to us the costing out of the various recommendations you have in the Coolfont report?
Yes, sir.
Now, building upon that report, how will you ensure that a comprehensive plan to prevent further transmission of the virus and meet the needs of those already infected is developed and effectively implemented?
Well, and again, you're talking about information education risk reduction programs, or?
The entire set of proposals that you've got in here, Coolfont report.
Well, as far as the recommendations made in that report, essentially all of them are within the Public Health Service's responsibility and authority to do so, with several exceptions. And one of the exceptions deals with the whole issue of cost of medical care. And there we've made the recommendation that the department consider appointing a commission to look into that and see what can be done to further those recommendations. But essentially everything else is within the Public Health Service responsibility, and we are taking on that responsibility with appropriate plans to carry them out.
The report makes clear that AIDS is a national problem, that over the next 5 years it will spread across the country rather than being concentrated predominantly in New York and California. What steps are being taken to assure that healthcare professionals are prepared to handle AIDS properly in the various jurisdictions across the country? What steps are being taken now to assure access to information regarding treatment therapies, both general information and information regarding clinical trials?
There are several, I'll ask Dr. Fauci to speak to the second part, but there are several proposals to get out additional information and to inform the medical community as well as the general public, and that is being dealt with one of the other agencies, HRSA, at the present moment. But let me ask Dr. Fauci to speak to the NIH information on drugs.
Yeah, with regard to the treatment, it's a combination both of the types of announcements we made yesterday to make both the biomedical research as well as the lay public aware of the centers that are involved, and also an amplified utilization of the PDQ system to have the protocols available for ready access through the PDQ computer system.
As you've been listening to the testimony from the earlier panels, I'm sure you've gathered that the professionals out there, as well as the patients, have no sense that, in fact, there is a ready availability of that information at this point.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll change that.
The Coolfont report also calls for more education and counseling What plans are underway to reach beyond the currently defined risk groups, Dr. Dowdle?
Well, there are several different approaches that are being considered. One is additional information to the public. The second is additional information and risk reductions program aimed at specific geographic areas as well as certain populations. And third is the major thrust that we hope to engage in with the states related to testing and counseling, voluntary testing and counseling.
Do you see this as becoming an even more serious problem given the crossing over and the increase in the heterosexual community? How do you convince the heterosexual community to adopt safer sex practices without totally panicking people about AIDS?
Well, we do feel that this is a major area in which we have to direct our efforts, particularly in certain geographic areas where heterosexual spread might be more frequent. I'm speaking here specifically of areas where there's IV drug abuse and where there may be heterosexual spread through IV drug abuse into non-IV drug abusing spouses or sexual partners. I think that we also have to consider that there are other more specific programs that may be directed in other parts of the country as well to other, the so-called high-risk groups.
But isn't part of the problem that, in fact, at this stage, the spread is cutting away just from the IV drug-using population, but into the general heterosexual community?
That's our point. I'm sorry. What I meant as far as targeted information programs and would be education programs would be specifically aimed in those areas where this may be an initial route of transmission, but now is occurring in the heterosexual population without regard to contact to the initial, if you will, transmitter of the infection through IV drug abuse.
And what plans do you have for dealing with that?
Well, that's one of the plans now, is to try to get up a package, a targeted package that can be effective in providing that information. Let me, if I may, comment a minute on the information education risk reduction program. Is that initially there was a feeling that, particularly among individuals who'd been in the public health service and the venereal disease control programs for many years, that this was not an effective way to go. And we used to say, we only have information and education programs in AIDS. But in fact, evidence has come in more and more from such cities as Boston and Chicago and San Francisco, which shows that the annual rate of seroconversion among the homosexual populations under study has just dropped precipitously. Where it was 18 and 20% a year, it's now dropped 8, 4, 3% a year. It's an incredibly encouraging report from many of these cities. And we feel like that with the added emphasis now that we're not talking about just a sexually transmitted disease, we're talking about a fatally sexually transmitted disease, that information education programs are far more effective.
The report also recommends testing and counseling for those in high-risk groups. What is the estimate of the number of people that would be included in that high-risk groups?
Well, in the number in the high-risk groups, of course, would vary depending on the city, and we really didn't come up with a figure that would try to reach everyone. But what we were talking about is certain areas which are more likely to encounter high-risk groups, and that would be sexually transmitted disease clinics. That would be in public health city, local public health clinics that may be dealing with individuals in high-risk groups and so on.
How much money are you requesting in the fiscal '87 budget for that purpose, for education?
It's, again, still something that's being worked out, which we could provide.
Well, you've submitted a fiscal '87 request already. That's as a matter of fact, in all probability, has been, although the numbers are being held, has been reported out by the subcommittee. So the question really is what is the current request?
For that?
For education and counseling of high-risk groups.
I would have to give you that, I would have to provide that to you.
Okay. Does the Public Health Service hold to its recommendation that high-risk individuals be tested in light of the Department of Justice's opinion that persons who are seropositive can be fired if an employer is concerned about transmission in the workplace? And how are you going to adjust your recommendation in light of this legal reality?
That, of course, that event has come about after our initial recommendations and after our Cool Fund meeting, and we will, of course, have to look at this carefully and see what effect it may have.
Well, it is going to have an effect, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
The report, the Cole-Font report, also makes clear the need to address care and treatment issues. What measures are being taken to assure adequate care and treatment for upwards of 200,000 patients expected in the next 5 years?
Well, again, I'd like to, Tony, you want to start there?
No, this is the not treatment, this is the medical care.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. Yes. Okay. Again, this is an area that is not within the Public Health Service's area of responsibility. What we are trying to attempt to do in the Cool Fund report is to try to show what the problems may be, and that we're recommending that other areas, agencies within the department recognize these potential problems.
A number of you participated in the international conference in Paris last week. Reports of that meeting were extremely pessimistic, save for the report on bone marrow transplants and a very few others. In regard to drugs for treatment, would you please give us your own sense as to what impression you got? Dr. Fauci, maybe we ought to start with you.
I think what we have seen and are seeing and will see in AIDS is small building blocks of knowledge in areas of the various disciplines that impact on AIDS: immunology, virology, molecular biology, and treatment. What we saw was something that was not so much pessimistic as it was not a very great splash, no real major large numbers of breakthroughs, which really I think is something that we would expect to see, is not a large number of breakthroughs, but we've reached the state of the art now in AIDS, biomedical science, and research that little increments in knowledge will hopefully keep us going in the right direction so that we will be able to make important inroads in the direction of treatment, vaccine, and clinical care. And although there were no major splashes, there was a lot of solid consolidation of a lot of research that's going on, particularly in this country, but also in other countries throughout the world.
Were there any presentations on the costs or coordination of the international effort?
Not to my knowledge, Walt, was there? No.
And I guess finally, would you care, any of you, Dr. Dowdle, Dr. Fauci, would you care to do an update on Secretary Heckler's projection of 1984 as to how close we were to developing an adequate treatment regimen as well as a vaccine?
Well, I think that it would be realistic to say that given where we are now with early testing of various protein components of the virus in monkeys, and then hopefully being able to immunize chimps and then challenge them with the live virus, that we won't have the beginnings of early phase studies in humans at the earliest 1988. And if you're talking about when a vaccine will be available for widespread use in the population, that will definitely go well into the next decade. So I think you're talking into the 1990s on this, perhaps another 8 years from now or longer, because the very nature of the virus and the very nature of the disease itself, even though I certainly predict that we'll be making important advances starting right now, which we already have with certain of these studies, the amount of study that needs to be done before you can have a vaccine that's widely available for the population will be measured in several years.
And I assume that that's assuming maximum effort.
That is assuming that everything goes well, yes, and maximum effort.
Right, and that this is not something that can be done on the cheap, that is going to take a commitment of of resources in addition to the talent and expertise that's available in the scientific community.
Yes.
I said finally, but I have one question I want to get for the record. Is there a registry of patients and doctors who want treatment and to participate in trials? And will you be developing that if there is not?
With regard to the treatment evaluation units that we're talking about, yes, yes, that will be, there will be.
You don't have it at this point?
No,
It's not in
because
place, right?
they've not been implemented. They will be, though.
Okay. Well, we'll have some additional questions which we will submit to you in writing, and we'll keep the record open for some period of time in order for you to respond to us. You can do that as expeditiously as possible. And again, I express my appreciation to all of you and to the medical and scientific people whom you represent, and hope that you will in fact maintain the pressure on those people at the political and budgetary levels in government who don't seem to have a sufficient appreciation as to how grave this crisis really is. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.